Welcome to United Choose channel.
The question we wanted to discuss today was the polarization of the two different political parties in America and how one side just plainly hates the other, and it's very, very big division. What are the main reasons that America is so divided politically?
I think it all kind of starts from politicians and how they kind of, at least in modern day America, they kind of like to pit the two sides against one another. So they kind of create it as like a who's the bigger party, the better party. And then I think at the same time, I think politicians like really try to say what they think their audience will like to hear. So I think especially right now, I think a lot of people are focusing on the more radical sides of it, and they kind of see if you're on one side, then you're completely like radical about it. So I think that also has to do with it. That makes people more radical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think also because it's more of like a debate on morality, it hurts when you say one person's morality is skewed. And I'm not talking like racism, etc. Like that's I think also has more to do with radical right, like stuff like that. But I think it's like each side assumes the other side's moralities rather than actually listening or trying to understand where they're coming from. You're just assuming the radical side's
Definitely,
ideas
yeah.
of what's right and wrong.
I think it's also like, considering, at least for me, politics are like so complicated here, and there's so many values to each party or each side, that you identify yourself as one and then you automatically believe all the rest and you don't go further because you're like, yeah, I believe that one thing, oh, I must be a part of that party. And that's kind of like, I feel like if people did more research and were more like, I mean, I guess I understand it's like super hard to do research. Like for me, like me, but have it like, that's I think what pitted the two sides against each other is just ignorance. People don't really understand the situations.
I think also because it's a two-party system, and I understand there's a lot of benefits to it being a two-party system because it's like tries to minimize the complications and like there's more of a greater vote for either side. But I think the fact that there's only two sides to choose from, you choose the sides that have more pros to you than cons, and that like also leads to blindly following a side and causes more prejudice against one another.
You said how like if I have the most pros to this one side, I must also follow all the other things, or like you can't like choose, you can't dabble in one and dabble in the other at the same time.
Right.
You have to be like, oh, I mostly this one, so I have to be only this one. You can't be like,
Yeah. And then
take
I feel
different
like
values.
if you try to have a conversation when someone kind of assumes where you stand, it's really hard to have a conversation just because it feels like the two sides just want to kind of argue and not really like listen and try to understand what the other person is saying. I feel like people, they just try to think about what they're going to say.
So much of what each side means, we've kind of defined ourselves that it isn't necessarily what the beliefs of that party is because of politicians' beliefs and because of like liberal and conservatism. I think the two parties have like skewed definitions. So depending who you ask, they might have different definitions of what their side means.
Definitely, definitely. And then now also left means different than liberal, and then which means different than
Right.
like other.
It's
Yeah.
very complicated. Yeah.
Hmm. And I think that's also like a way of explaining people who are like libertarian, for example. That's kind of like a way of explaining people, but then or a way of explaining people's views, but then it's also at the same time kind of, it's hard to directly have say one word which defines exactly what you believe and what you stand for.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also like, yeah.
Do you think that this was a gradual change towards the division, or was there like just a specific event that was like, okay, now we're divided for the rest of time?
I think it was kind of gradual, but then during certain generations, like I said earlier, it became, the two sides became more polarized. For example, during slavery, I also know that Republican and Democrat, the terms, I guess you could say that they were switched, or they like the parties kind of evolved and they became different. To some people it switched, to others it like means different things. So I think like the definition of the two parties, they were very more similar when they first were created. And then as time and different like current events happen where people could have more polarized opinions, and then they did start polarizing, and then it kept polarizing, because I feel like the generation we're living now is a lot more polarized than like two generations before us. But then at the same time, maybe like during the war on drugs, that was even more polarized. But I think it goes in and out, depends on what's going on in the country.
I think also there was more of a division between like conservatism and liberal opinions, and the more they were put into like Democratic and Republican parties, that's when there was more of a very specific division, because I think there was always more of a divide between those two rather than the actual parties.
I feel like there's always like two sides to an opinion. If the government wants something, there's always going to be a part of the government that wants the exact opposite thing or something different. So I think like even from creation of America, there was of course always a divide. There was the should there be a central bank or should there not be a central bank? So I think it's always been like that. But I think in the beginning of, let's say, American history, there was more of like a healthier environment, if I'm willing to say, because it was more of a like, let's discuss this together and let's come to a conclusion. Here it's like, if you're not going to do what I'm going to do, then you know what, no,
you're not the person,
no. And then you get into this whole kind of even bigger divide, because one's like, like it's like two childs at a playground. If you make a compromise right away, or you start making compromises, then everything's going to be good. But if one child says no, 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 and then build up, and then it's always no.
Kind of last scrambled thoughts, but I think also, well, I kind of also mentioned this before, but I think politicians thrive off of the polarity of America currently, and I think that's kind of like the route that especially like Trump has been taking, because he really tries to appeal to his audience, in my opinion, and he like very clearly like doesn't, I think he could win over extra voters that are like not as far right leaning, who wouldn't vote for him still, but he's very clearly like trying to appease the like more righter side, in my opinion.
I think that applies to both sides of the politicians.
Yeah, I think you said like how politicians build off this polarity. People who hate the other side with a passion, they're automatically going to have more passion for what they believe in. So building off like politicians thrive of that polarity, because they're like, oh, there's people have more passion and more emotions, and that helps politicians rise up, in my opinion.
It also hurts discussions when you're trying to.
It's become more of a.
Yep.
Do you like kind of support this type of division, or like consider it beneficial to the country and to the system, or do you think if it's more harming?
I think it's sorry.
No,
I think it's more complex than that, because for example, when you look, if like there were more parties involved, the question is, how would people choose? How would the voting system be? So I think giving people two options is a little bit easier, but it has caused such a divide and such like a hatred for one another that it's not as beneficial anymore for the country. So I think it's more of a, who is it beneficial for, and at what point does it stop being beneficial?
Yeah, I feel like if there's a lot of political parties, it's like, if there's a really big group, there's automatically one that's going to become the natural leader or the natural one ahead. So even if there was the option, like there's options for other parties even right now. It's not the law is that there's only Republican and Democratic. It's just that they're so big. You know what I mean? It's like they're naturally going to grow.
I think something that we kind of lose sight of is the fact that Democrats and Republicans, I think, are a lot more similar, not exactly policy-wise, but they're a lot more similar than we assume them to be. And we maybe like the far far left believes in like something more slightly socialist, and then the far right believes more in free markets. But it's still capitalism at its core, and it's still it's not it's still like a similar form of government because we're building off of the Constitution. And so I think it's detrimental to the people more than anything else. The how far polarized it is, I think it's like beneficial to have, like you guys said, like two. It's just, it makes sense. But I think it's more detrimental to the people. I think people kind of get distracted by it, and it's kind of like an addiction when you're like addicted to seeing, who's winning, who's losing. You're kind of addicted to the anger towards the other side. And I think that's like the worst part about it, is that it makes people angrier. It makes people, less understanding of other people and where they're coming from. And I think it's like it hurts society overall more than anything else.
I'll go back to what you were saying in the beginning, or Masha was saying. I think it's kind of inevitable to end up with a two-party system, because at the end of the day, even if we're similar at the core, I think each side has opinions that are completely opposite, and the issue is that you can't find a compromise. Like, there's a lot of things that there is no middle. There's just no compromise between. So that's why there's two parties, because each side represents one or the other. And then depending on which of those ideas come to power, come to law, that's where you have a hatred towards the other side, because that's not the belief that you think should be law. So yeah, I think it's almost inevitable to have like no compromise, and therefore a two-party system, which doesn't mean I support it, doesn't mean it's better, but it does become somewhat inevitable.
I feel like in my opinion, which is like very kind of out there, I don't think a two-party like system would work out, even if it like works for the first couple of generations. Like, for example, like we start right up from the beginning and it's just like naturally divides into two parties and it's kind of friendly, but over generations it's always going to be inevitable that the two are going to start pining against each other and there's going to be no middle ground. And so I feel like a reason for why this is done is so that, like, for example, when we're electing officials and they're like, I'm a Republican, you can kind of assume everything, like their mindset or their values, and then you wouldn't like have to, because like what would happen, for example, if there was no political parties and people just would state their values and they could be dabbling from both sides, but it's just their values that they're pushing for? Like, well, would that work, or would?
I think that would work, like if we had, if we kind of like if we molded our own president. Okay. I don't think that would work that well, because I feel like we're more voting for people. Actually, we're voting for parties, but we kind of like assume we have the person in mind, So in like an ideal world, you could have like, it's hard. I think it's hard to find a politician as a person that is like that flexible, because they still want to like be like, no, this is what I believe in, and then you vote for me or you don't. And then the politicians like that that I feel like it'll just be like more scattered, the votes, because it'll be like, more people vote for this.
But so I think it could work if you completely change the voting system. If you change the way that their platforms are presented, and if you change the way that it's, because now, I mean, each person runs with like it's
or a party.
Biden and Kamala, right? Like it's more than there's one president and there's more representatives of who you're voting for. But I think if you completely change the way that a president runs,
I think a lot of that actually has to do with the funding they receive and the amount of advertisements. I personally think that should be like limited, and it should be you should have the same amount for both parties, or at least try to have the same amount, or I think that's the biggest part of why certain presidents or certain candidates never even make it to the top 4 or whatever, because they don't have enough money to get up there.
But then isn't that already a discussion between the sides? Like, wouldn't that, as it is, become a discussion of should it not? Like,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion.
What can be done to make everything like more communal, like not as divided? Like, what can we do? Like, literally, like me in my class, or what at your work?
Discussions with people that have a different opinion than you, and just I think the biggest thing is like the way you present it. If you're like talking calmly and you're just like, oh really, I disagree, I feel like we need to normalize that. We need to normalize saying, oh, I don't think so, because I feel like for me that's extremely hard to say someone to their face, like I don't agree with, not I don't agree with what you're saying, but like having like a constructive discussion. And I think that's like the biggest way to open people's minds and to start like understanding where other people are coming from. Even if it's not a discussion shouldn't be to agree with the other person, it should be to understand why they think what they think, even if by the end of it that you will never agree with them, you still understand what they think.
I used to be extremely like democratic and or not democratic, extremely liberal, and I didn't understand like how people could be anything else. And then I met more people who were either just Republican or conservative, and you have to listen to what they're telling you rather than making assumptions, because what they say might not represent all of the conservative side, all of the Republican side, and vice versa. But then I have friends who are like, I will not be friends with you if you're a Republican. I will not be friends with you if you're a conservative. Like, you are going against my morals. But are you listening to what their morals are? Or are you just considering their candidate, or considering their, like, I don't think people genuinely listen, because first of all, I've heard people are scared for their rights, or like they have a misconception of what each of the other side is. And so if you genuinely listen to people on the other side rather than just candidates, and rather than just like reading, because I think most people are in an echo chamber of people of the similar ideas as them. And I've had many people who like will not even listen to what I have to say.
Yeah.
Even if I'm defending my Republican friend, towards someone, they will refuse to listen to me, even though I'm not like Republican. They just completely don't want to. And I think it goes for either side. I'm not like trying to call out a certain side, but I think you genuinely have to listen to individual people rather than making assumptions of a whole.
Yeah, so like not assuming that whatever the candidate for that party is, talking about presidential, for example, you don't assume that they're the face of that party and everything they say is true to me. So like not, again, going back to not blindly following.
Mm-hmm. And even if they do believe in something you disagree with, listening to their reasoning, because their reasoning might make more sense than you think.
Yeah.
Like most, I think Democrats think that conservatives are like Christians and like follow it because of the Bible, but they might have more reasoning. And if you listen, I think you'll understand a lot more of the side, and that goes towards Democrats. Like, yeah, Democrats. Like, it goes either way. Just listening to their ideas and then listening to where those ideas come from. And if you still disagree, that's fine. Still respecting either side.
I feel like also another thing, like going back, I talked about having like not blindly following and doing research. I feel like having a more educated understanding of your party, whatever it may be, and the other party. Like, you can't know everything on what's happening on the political scheme. Like, that's impossible. But like having an understanding of like the major things. Like, for example, me, like before this, I didn't know anything, and I just always avoided the political discussions because I was like, I don't have no idea what I'm talking about. So I think it goes to like, I've never, how do I say this? Like, for example, like in my history classes, we've never had a discussion about what are the two parties, except for like what were the two parties when America was created, like a long time ago. But like it changes literally not every week, but like pretty often. So I think like this isn't like a push for, hey, schools teach us government things, but like having resources and having kind of pushing yourself to have a better understanding of both the parties, not just yours, because if you just have yours, then that's not good either. That's even worse than being ignorant. But like having
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to add to your school point. I think definitely should be much more taught in schools. But I think on one hand, schools are scared of people being uncomfortable, and
they're scared to like have to be perceived as pushing a political party.
Yeah, that literally
biases.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the only way to have people be more comfortable with it is just trying to like show facts, and show like this is what happened, this is what this did this and that did that, and having it like explained to you regularly. And I feel like if kids hear it more, then they'll be more open to hearing in other parts of their lives.
I think the biggest challenge Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I think having resources at schools, it's kind of impossible to not have a bias for what you're teaching. So rather than teachers simply teaching it, I think there should be resources or types of like panel discussions. I think you can have, you can bring in either students who want to talk about it and making sure there's like similar amount of people on each side, or if you don't want to involve students in it because that could become potentially dangerous, giving them resources, bringing other people in to have these discussions, because discussions is where you're going to go. Rather, like you said, facts, sure, but a lot more of it, even facts can be skewed by biases. So when you have people on each side having like a calm discussion, I think that already sets a
good atmosphere.
Right.
But
a safe space. Sorry,
but I feel like at the same time, if you have people come in and talk, they're gonna have their own personal opinion. So you're already receiving a biased, because they might not know everything. So then it becomes the fact of, are they actually the best representation of that party? And then you start pinning that whole party on that one experience you had with like, oh, the Republican Party must be like that because from that one talk I heard from a Republican. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
So like it's really difficult to teach it and to bring in speakers that talk about it too.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to have a lot of different speakers with different biases, and you would have to make it like a year, not a year-long thing, but have it, throughout the duration of however long you're like every.
You can finish. Sorry, I think I cut you.
Last mini thought. You could have like 4 speakers a semester, and then 2 of them are on each side, and then keep that going throughout like 8 years, just to have like by the end you're like completely immersed in so many people's different opinions. Then you kind of realize that like, you have to somewhere along the line create your own.
So maybe instead of keeping it up to schools, because I know each school also, like my school is very liberal. So maybe instead of like making schools bring in people, we create a system in which schools can teach through. And then different people can come in and speak. And schools will show, like it can be panel discussions, it could be questionnaires, whatever. And then each school is getting the same type of information, and they have those resources. So even if they don't show it at school, they can give those resources to students. Because finding those resources are so difficult. And further than that, finding resources that aren't on your side are even more difficult because you don't know how to find them.
Yeah, it's very hard to find a resource that's unbiased. And do you think it would be better for sources to be offered and the student has to do the exploration themselves, or for it to be of a more regulated school thing? The school is like, oh, we're going to teach you this.
I mean, I think it could be both. Once school starts teaching it, I think it becomes more of like a dangerous to students, and more like confrontational, which I mean can be good and can be bad, but so you were saying like it's difficult to find a non-biased source. I think the issue isn't only like finding a non-biased source, because everyone has a bias. Even if you're writing a factual essay, even if you're writing an essay on like what happened and you're only given facts, there is going to be a bias. Each story has a different narrative, and you're choosing a narrative to come from. So I think it's nearly impossible to come up with like non-biased resources, but finding different people that represent different narratives is what's going to give you a more full perspective rather than a non-biased perspective, because I think that's impossible to create.
Yeah, definitely.
Any finishing thoughts?
Aristotle once said, actually, it might have not been Aristotle, but someone once said that the best form of government is a monarchy where you have a very benevolent ruler, but you're never going to know that you're going to have a very benevolent ruler. So I think that there's no perfect system, but I think that just because living in the world we are today, we all care a lot about democracy. And I think that, we have to build up from that basis and kind of try to understand other people's thoughts and where they're coming from. And I think it's always really hard to find a perfect system. And I don't think, at least currently, like maybe in, everything gets better and better, but well, not everything, but things like in general tend to progress in the positive direction. So maybe I think that there's no system in a government that works perfectly. There's always going to be issues, but we aim to, I think, like better people's livelihoods.
Yeah.
So we'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah,